Okay guys, so just quickly, there's a point that says you gotta study the joints of the vertebral column and the thorax. This is a huge topic, so I think I will try to cover it in one video just for the simplicity of it. It might be confusing for some, but once you get your head around it and you look at pictures of how those joints are formed and stuff like that, you'll be able to ace all of your doubts. Okay, so joints of the vertebral column. First and foremost, the easiest vertebral joint found in the vertebral column is, of course, joints of the vertebral bodies. There's symphysis, which means that it's secondary cartilaginous. If you open our video on the joints, you can find secondary cartilaginous joints, and these are made up of IV discs between the individual vertebrae, between their bodies actually, and they're made up of annulus fibrosus and nucleus pulposus. Just know this, and you can probably, through your video, you can pause and read more about it right here. I just want to move on for the simplicity of the video. So first joints of the vertebral bodies. You just mention them to him while answering, and I think you'll be fine. He may want you to explain more, but there's always a bit more information to read from here. So let's continue. So joints of the vertebral bodies, IV discs. Next, anterior longitudinal ligaments. Yes, I know it's so confusing. How can be a ligament be a joint, right? But for Sereski, you've got to mention those things, the ligaments that surround those vertebral bodies along the vertebral column, because he considers them as joints. So make sure you mention them. So anterior longitudinal ligament, they're found on the anterolateral aspects of the vertebral bodies and the IV disc. So anteriorly, they cover, this ligament runs along the huge body of the vertebral column, covering the anterior parts of the vertebral column. So just search up anterior longitudinal ligament online and you'll see what I'm talking about. If there's an anterior longitudinal ligament, there's of course going to be a posterior longitudinal ligament, and this is found on the posterior aspect of the bodies of the vertebral column. As I said, they run along posterior aspect of the vertebral bodies. And of course, if it's on the posterior aspect of vertebral bodies, the only way it can run through, it'll be the vertebral canal. Okay, next, there's joints of the vertebral arches. I don't know why we should be talking this, but one joint that I can remember off my top of my head is the Xiphopophygeal joint. You don't need to actually say joints of the vertebral arch. No, just say Xiphopophygeal joint, and then you're good to go. But just explain to him where those joints are and what they are. So of course it's a plain joint. The articular surface is the superior inferior articular process of the adjacent vertebrae. So it is between those articular surfaces of the articular processes of the vertebrae. So it's there to help stabilize the vertebrae. It's part of its functions. Next is the accessor ligament of the IV joints. More ligaments, but these are joints for Sereski. So you will mention ligamenta flava, you'll mention the interspinous ligaments, supraspinous ligaments, the nuchal ligament, and all of those ligaments are important, and he will want to ask you how are they situated from anterior to posterior. So you would start with anterior, posterior, you would then mention the ligamenta flava, the interspinous and the supraspinous, and then the nuchal ligament. So many pictures on Google for you to follow through, and I will explain what I mean when we meet on the webinars. Next, we can talk about the craniovertebral joints. This is between the vertebra and the cranium, so like the skull. There are two joints involved here, the atlanto-occipital joint and the atlanto-axial joint. The atlanto-occipital joint, from its name, it's between the atlas and the occipital condylar processes of the occipital bone of the skull. The atlanto-axial joint is between the atlas and the axis of the vertebrae. Next, we have the transverse ligament of atlas, the longitudinal bands, and the alar ligaments. These are part of the atlantoaxial joint, okay? It's very sufficient for you to know the names and memorize all those joints and just mention it to him. With a little bit of explanation, you'll be fine. Next and finally is a tectoral membrane. Sorry, just give me a second. Tectoral membrane is part of the atlantoaxial joint as well. Okay, these are all the joints of the vertebral column. You can go back and repeat it. We're going to now move on to the joints of the thorax. The joints of the thorax can be quite confusing. So I would advise each and every one of you to actually get out images from Google or anywhere, let's say Sobota as well, for you to be able to look at how those joints are formed so that you can have an image inside your brain when you're explaining to him what those joints are. Okay, next. Joints of the thorax. The intervertebral, they are symphyses, which are between the adjacent vertebral bodies. Yes, the IV discs are part of the joints of the thorax because the vertebral column forms the posterior part of the thorax, so they put it here. Next, the costovertebral joints of head of rib and the costotransverse. So the costovertebral joints of head of rib, so from its name, we can know what this joint is. Costovertebral. Costo is rib, vertebral is the vertebral body. So explanation, head of each rib with superior demifacet or costal facet of each vertebral body. The demifacet and costal facet part, like just go into looking at pictures to understand what I mean, but just off the simplicity, it's between the rib and the vertebral body. Okay? Costovertebral. Costotransverse is between the tubercle of the rib, as I said on my rib and sternum video. There's a tubercle on the rib part posteriorly that articulates with the transverse process of the corresponding vertebral body. So it's between the tubercle and the transverse process of the vertebral body. As I said, go if you don't understand what the transverse process of the vertebral body is, go study the structures of individual vertebrae to know exactly what the transverse process is of a vertebral body. And this transverse process articulates with the tubercle of the rib. So posteriorly, the rib articulates with the vertebra with two joints. Please look at images. Okay. Next, sternocostal joint. From its name, sternocostal, sternum, ribs. Okay. It's between the rib and the sternum. Yes, sternum. So you have 7 of those joints. Here, just weirdly, but you have to remember, the first one only, between the first rib and the sternum, which is on the Manubrium, is a primary cartilaginous joint. There's a costal cartilage. Articulation is with the first costal cartilage with the Manubrium. Okay, so let me just get a pen here. I need to explain something. So when a rib articulates with the sternum, you have sternum, you have ribs, right? But before, in general, there's ribs, but actually, for every rib, there's a costal cartilage, then comes the rib. Okay, so always remember, when the rib joins onto the sternum, it doesn't join directly with its bony structure, but no, sternum and rib are connected together by costal cartilage. That's why it says here, first costal cartilage with Manubrium. Okay. Now, the sternocostal joints of the 2nd to 7th are synovial plane joints. This is a different type of joint, remember, according to 3 classifications of joints. 2nd to 7th costal cartilage with Manubrium. Remember, always there's a costal cartilage joining the rib and the sternum together. The rib doesn't directly connect to the sternum, but it's connected to the costal cartilage that connects it to the sternum. Then we have the sternoclavicular joint. The sternoclavicular joint is between the sternum and the clavicle. It's a saddle type of joint, and remember, this is a very good tip. Sarisky mentioned that this is a saddle joint, but because of its structure, it can also be considered as a ball and socket because of its large ability of movement. Okay, it's between the sternal end of the clavicle. Yes, the sternal end of the clavicle, it means that the part of the clavicle closer to the sternum. Okay, sternal end of the clavicle with manubrium. The manubrium is the superior part of the sternum. And first, costal cartilage. We need to look at images, and I'll show you guys later. The clavicle articulates directly with the manubrium plus the first costal cartilage of the first rib. Okay, so that's just a connection on those two parts, and they're all close to each other when you look at the images. Okay, next we have the costochondral. Costochondral is basically the joint between the rib, the bone, and the costal cartilage. So we're basically talking now about this joint right here. This is the costochondral joint. Okay, so you have sternum. Okay, then you have costal cartilage. Then you have ribs. Okay, the sternocostal is this joint. The costochondral is this joint. Okay, just know this, and you will have to really look at the images to really understand. And this is primary cartilaginous, so we'd have to also know their type. Okay, it's between the lateral end of costal cartilage with sternal end of rib. Okay, that's exactly what I mentioned here. Interchondral, it is found in ribs 6th, 7th, 7th, 8th, 8th, 9th. If you remember, there's always false ribs. False ribs do not attach directly by its own costal cartilage to the sternum, but ribs 7, 8, 9, and I think 10, they attach to the costal cartilage of number 7. So if you see, like, all those ribs will be attached here, and then there comes 7, then 8, 9, 10. These joints right here, between each other, and I'll show you what I mean when we do the webinars, are interchondral. You can type also in Google to see exactly what I'm talking about. And they're synovial plane joints, and they're said to be between costal cartilage of 6 to 7, 7 to 8, 8 to 9. It's a very simple idea, but you just need to look at pictures. Finally, the Manubrium joint is at the sternal angle. It's between the Manubrium and the body of the sternum. Okay, so you have Manubrium of sternum, body of sternum, and then xiphoid process. We're talking about this joint right here. That's the Manubrium joint. Okay, it is secondary cartilaginous joint, and it's found between the Manubrium and the body of the sternum. And finally, the Xiphosternal joint is between the body of the sternum and the xiphoid process. It's a primary cartilaginous joint. This one is a secondary cartilaginous joint. And as I said, it's between the xiphoid process and the body of the sternum. This is the point of your syllabus to cover the joints of the vertebrae and the joints of the thorax. Quite hard in the beginning, maybe a lot of those joints are present, but it'll all make sense when you look at pictures, because these are only going to be studied and fixed in your brain once you have mental images of them. And always, if you have questions, we'll always be there to answer them. Awesome, guys. Thank you very much. I think I've covered all of your things related to this Monday's lesson. And always, if I miss something, we can answer them on the webinars. See you guys in the next video.